Ba, ba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. One for the master, one for the dame, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. Let me tell you about the day I realized I was living this nursery rhyme. I was freelancing at the time, finally making decent money after years of ramen noodles and crossed fingers. I'd just finished a big project when the requests started rolling in. My mum needed help with her mortgage. My sister wanted to borrow money for her kids' summer camp. My best friend was starting a business and thought I might want to invest. Even my neighbour knocked on my door asking if I could chip in for new landscaping for the building. Everyone was so polite about it, so reasonable, so sure that of course I'd want to help, because that's what good people do, right? Share the wealth, take care of family, support the community. And there I was, standing in my kitchen with a calculator, dividing up my 3 bags of wool before I'd even figured out what I needed for myself. 1 bag for family obligations, 1 bag for friend emergencies, 1 bag for being a decent human being who doesn't hoard resources while others struggle. Wait a minute. Where was my bag? That's when this innocent little children's song started feeling less like a nursery rhyme and more like a documentary about financial boundary violation. But before we dive into the psychological meat grinder that is modern resource management, let me tell you where this deceptively cheerful little ditty actually comes from. Because once you know the backstory, you'll never hear, yes sir, 3 bags full, the same way again. Picture this. It's 13th century England, and wool is basically medieval oil. It's the foundation of the entire economy. English wool is so fine, so sought after, that it's practically currency. Kings finance their wars with it. Merchants build empires trading it. It's the resource everyone wants a piece of. Now imagine you're a sheep farmer. Not some gentleman landowner, but a regular person, just trying to make a living with your flock. You've worked your arse off all year, shearing sheep, processing wool, getting your product ready for market. You've got your 3 bags of beautiful, valuable wool that represent months of labour and your family's security for the coming year. And then the tax collectors show up. The master in the rhyme, that's the local lord, claiming his feudal due. He gets 1 bag. The dame, that's his wife or maybe the church demanding their cut. Another bag gone. The little boy who lives down the lane? Some historians think that's a reference to the church's charity obligations, or maybe just the general community expectations that successful people share the wealth. So this poor sheep farmer, who did all the work, took all the risk, invested all the time and energy, ends up with nothing. 0 bags of wool for himself. He gets to say, yes sir, with a smile while his entire year's income gets redistributed to people who contributed exactly 0 sheep, 0 labour, and 0 risk to the enterprise. And somehow this tale of economic exploitation became a children's song. Because nothing says innocent playground fun, like teaching kids to cheerfully give away everything they've worked for. But here's where it gets really interesting from a shadow work perspective. That sheep isn't just saying yes to avoid conflict. The rhyme suggests he's almost eager to give it all away. Yes sir, 3 bags full. Like he's proud of how much he has to offer. Like generosity is his whole identity. Sound familiar? Let's start with the shadow that's probably making half of you squirm in your seats right now. The compulsive giver. The person who derives their entire sense of worth from how much they can provide for others, who feels guilty having anything if someone else needs it, who would literally give the wool off their own back if asked nicely enough. I see this shadow everywhere, but it's particularly brutal in people who grew up in families where love was conditional on usefulness, where being needed was the only way to guarantee you'd be kept around, where "what can you do for me?" was the unspoken question underlying every relationship. If this is your shadow, and be honest, you know if it is, you've probably spent years perfecting the art of anticipating what others need before they even ask. You're the one who always picks up the check, always volunteers for the extra shifts, always has room in your schedule for one more favor. You're the human equivalent of yes sir, 3 bags full. But here's what your shadow knows and your conscious mind doesn't want to face. Sometimes your giving isn't actually generous. Sometimes it's a protection racket you're running on yourself. Give enough. Be useful enough. Indispensable enough. And maybe people won't leave. Maybe they won't see that underneath all that wool, you're just as needy and vulnerable as everyone else. The really twisted part is that this shadow convinces you that having needs is selfish, but meeting everyone else's needs is virtuous. So you end up in relationships where you're always the giver and never the receiver, always the helper and never the helped, always the sheep and never the one asking for wool. And then you wonder why you feel so empty, so used, so resentful, even though you're the one who set up the whole dynamic in the first place. Now let's talk about the other side of this equation, the shadow that's probably making the other half of you uncomfortable, the entitled taker. The person who looks at other people's success, other people's resources, other people's good fortune, and automatically thinks, what's my cut? This shadow is sneaky because it disguises itself as all kinds of socially acceptable things: fairness, community, family loyalty, social responsibility. It's the voice in your head that says, well, they can afford it, or they don't really need all that, or after everything I've done for them, they owe me this much. Maybe you're the family member who always expects the successful sibling to pick up the tab. Maybe you're the friend who assumes your wealthy buddies should cover the expensive restaurant you suggested. Maybe you're the person who thinks anyone making more money then you should be paying higher taxes to fund programs you support. I'm not talking about legitimate needs or reasonable requests for help. I'm talking about that shadow part of you that feels automatically entitled to a piece of whatever pie someone else baked. The part that sees another person's 3 bags of wool and immediately starts dividing them up in your head. This shadow is particularly toxic because it transforms other people from individuals into resources. They stop being people with their own needs, dreams, and limitations, and become walking ATMs or emotional support systems or career networking opportunities. You start evaluating relationships based on what you can extract rather than what you can contribute. And the really fucked up part? This shadow often shows up strongest in people who are themselves generous. Because if you're always giving, if you're always helpful, if you're always there for everyone else, then surely it's only fair that others do the same for you, right? Wrong. But your shadow doesn't care about the logic. It just knows it's tired of being the sheep, and it wants someone else to hand over their wool for once. But there's an even deeper shadow lurking in this rhyme, and it's the one that drives both the compulsive giving and the entitled taking. The scarcity shadow. The belief buried so deep you might not even know it's there, that there isn't enough to go around, that resources are fundamentally limited, that someone else's success means less for you, that the world is a zero-sum game where every bag of wool given away is a bag you can't have. This shadow shows up in the giver as the panicked need to prove their worth before someone else beats them to it. It shows up in the taker as the desperate grab for resources before they all get claimed by someone else. It shows up in all of us as that low-level anxiety that maybe, just maybe, we won't have enough. I see this shadow wreaking havoc in families where siblings compete for parents' attention and resources like there's only a limited supply of love to go around. In workplaces where colleagues hoard information and opportunities because sharing feels like giving up their competitive edge. In communities where people fight over grants and funding like there's only one bag of wool in the entire universe. The scarcity shadow is what makes us see other people's good fortune as a threat to our own. It's what makes us keep score in relationships, measuring what we've given against what we've received like we're running some kind of cosmic accounting firm. It's what makes us say, yes sir, 3 bags full, not out of genuine generosity, but out of terror that if we don't, there might not be anything left when our turn comes. And then there's the shadow that ties all these others together. The boundary shadow. The part of you that was never taught that you get to have limits, that your resources, time, energy, money, attention are actually yours to allocate as you see fit, If you grew up in a family where boundaries were seen as selfishness, where saying no to a request was treated as a moral failing, where your worth was measured by how much you could sacrifice for others, then this shadow is probably running your entire relationship with resources. You end up like that poor sheep, cheerfully distributing your wool to anyone who asks, not because you want to, but because you literally don't know how to say no. The word feels dangerous, foreign, like something only bad people would use. This shadow is particularly brutal because it masquerades as virtue. Being boundaryless gets labeled as generous, selfless, loving. Having limits gets labeled as stingy, selfish, cold. So you end up in a world where taking care of yourself feels morally wrong, and giving yourself away feels like the only acceptable way to exist. But here's what your boundary shadow doesn't want you to figure out. Having limits isn't cruel. It's actually kinder to everyone involved. Because when you give from obligation instead of choice, when you say yes out of guilt instead of genuine desire, the energy you're putting into the world is poisoned with resentment. Here's what I've learned after years of untangling my own relationship with giving and receiving. Real generosity is only possible when you have the freedom to say no. When you give because you want to, not because you have to. When your yes means something because your no is always an option. The sheep in the original rhyme isn't actually generous, he's just compliant. True generosity requires choice, and choice requires boundaries. It requires knowing what you have, what you need, and what you're genuinely willing to share. When you give from a place of fullness instead of emptiness, when you share because you choose to instead of because you're afraid not to, the energy of that gift is completely different. It nourishes instead of depletes. It connects instead of creating obligation. It comes from love instead of fear. So the next time you hear this little rhyme, don't just think about medieval tax systems and adorable farm animals. Think about your own relationship with resources, with giving and receiving, with the difference between generosity and people-pleasing. Ask yourself, when someone asks if you have any wool, do you automatically start dividing it up for them? Or do you pause and check in with yourself first? Do you give from a place of abundance or scarcity? Do you know the difference between being generous and being used? Because here's the thing. We all have wool. Time, energy, money, attention, skills, love. We all have something valuable to offer the world. The question isn't whether you should share it. The question is how you want to share it, with whom, and in what way. You get to be the shepherd of your own resources. You get to decide who gets a bag of your wool and who doesn't. You get to set terms, establish boundaries, and create exchanges that feel good to everyone involved. And sometimes, the most generous thing you can do is say no. Because every time you give away wool, you don't actually have. Every time you say yes when you mean no, every time you sacrifice your own well-being to avoid disappointing someone else, you're not actually helping anyone. You're just teaching them that your needs don't matter, your boundaries don't exist, and your wool will always be available whenever they decide they need some. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe if you think what you've heard is important and useful.